The letter came on a Tuesday, tucked under the windshield wiper of Daniel Granger's pickup truck like a parking ticket left by a ghost. "Notice of code violation," the red letters screamed across the top, followed by a list of alleged infractions. So absurd it almost felt like parody. Unauthorized exterior lighting, non-compliant porch railing, roof material inconsistent with community standards. Daniel stood in his driveway, the early morning sun glinting off the steel toolbox in the truck bed, and felt a slow burn crawl up his chest. He'd built this house himself 10 years earlier, long before the new HOA president, Calvin Pierce, moved into the neighborhood with his manicured hedges, his designer dog, and his need to control everything that cast a shadow. The house wasn't just a structure to Daniel, it was proof that hard work could still beat a mortgage company. Every board of cedar, every sheet of tin on the roof had passed county inspection, signed and sealed. And now this man, this smug, rule-quoting, golf cart-riding bureaucrat, was threatening to fine him $100 a day until he brought his property into compliance. Daniel crumpled the letter in his fist and looked toward the cul-de-sac where Pierce's massive two-story sat gleaming like a showroom model. There was something about that house that never looked right. The angles were off, the siding newer than the foundation. Rumors said Pierce had expanded without a permit when he bought it, but nobody had ever checked. Daniel didn't care back then. Now he did. That night, he spread the violation notice across his kitchen table, next to his coffee mug, and a small pile of old property records. He muttered to himself, reading each line as if decoding a threat. Non-compliant materials, section 8.2. He flipped open the HOA handbook, same rule book Pierce himself had drafted 6 months ago, and found the clause. It was vague, almost deliberately so, referencing architectural uniformity without citing state or county law. In legal terms, that was smoke, not fire. Daniel highlighted it in yellow. Outside, rain began tapping against the window panes, steady and cold. He imagined his father's voice, the man who taught him how to lay a foundation straight and true, saying, "Never let a man write rules he doesn't have to follow." Maybe that was the key. Maybe Pierce's house didn't follow the rules either. By morning, Daniel had decided if the HOA wanted a fight, he'd fight on paper first. He drove down to the county recorder's office, a beige building that smelled of dust and toner, and paid $10 for public copies of every building permit filed in Maple Ridge Estates since 2008. The clerk, a woman with gray hair and reading glasses chained around her neck, looked up when she saw the name Pierce. "You sure you want to print all these?" she asked. "It's a lot of paper." Daniel smiled thinly. "Yeah." Every page. 346 pages later, he sat in the parking lot flipping through the stack, tracing the history of his neighborhood like tree rings. Every homeowner had at least one permit on file: roof repairs, patio extensions, window replacements, except one, Calvin Pierce. For a man obsessed with compliance, his file was a void. Daniel took a slow breath. Maybe the rumor was true. Maybe Pierce's showpiece of a house was sitting on a secret the HOA couldn't afford to admit. That night he logged into the county's digital zoning map and cross-checked parcel boundaries. Pierce's backyard extension, that gleaming glass-walled sunroom everyone envied, jutted 12 feet beyond the recorded property line into what was technically easement land, public utility access. Building there wasn't just a violation, it was illegal construction. Daniel stared at the map until midnight, adrenaline buzzing through his veins. The hypocrisy was almost elegant. The man who fined neighbors for mismatched mailboxes had built his own house partly on stolen ground. Still, Daniel knew accusation alone wasn't enough. He needed evidence, photographs, coordinates, documentation, because people like Pierce didn't lose arguments, they lost lawsuits. So Daniel planned quietly. He marked sunrise angles, measured shadows, used his phone's GPS to triangulate fence lines. Over the next week, he collected proof, the exact footage, the slope, the encroachment, even photos of utility markers half buried under Pierce's imported sod. With every new discovery, the anger inside him hardened into purpose. But when Pierce found out someone was poking around his property, the game changed fast. One afternoon, Daniel returned home to find 2 uniformed county inspectors waiting in his driveway. "Anonymous complaint," one said. "We need to check your workshop for safety compliance." Inside, they snapped photos, measured outlets, cited him for missing GFCI plugs, petty stuff but enough to rack up hundreds in fines. It was retaliation, plain and simple. Daniel didn't protest. He just smiled. Because the more desperate Pierce became, the closer Daniel was to exposing him. That night, he sent copies of the property map and photos to a friend who worked part-time at the Gazette. "Just in case," he wrote. Then he sat alone on his porch, rain dripping off the eaves, staring at Pierce's glowing windows across the street. "You built your throne on stolen ground," he whispered. "And I'm going to make sure everyone knows it." 3 mornings later, Daniel woke to the growl of an engine outside, an HOA maintenance truck idling at the curb, orange hazard lights spinning lazy circles across his front windows. 2 men in reflective vests unloaded paint buckets and stencils marked "Property Line Survey." They weren't from the county. Their truck bore the HOA logo freshly printed on magnetic decals. Daniel stepped outside, coffee steaming in his hand. "You boys lost?" he asked. The taller one read from a clipboard. "Per order of the board, we're remarking easements and boundary limits." Daniel smirked. "Funny, because only the county can authorize that, and you sure don't look like the county." The men exchanged glances, muttered something about supervisor approval, then packed up and left. But their short visit told him everything. Pierce was spooked. He'd heard whispers of Daniel's digging and was trying to reassert control through intimidation. That evening, Daniel found a new letter taped to his door, thicker than before. It wasn't a violation notice this time. It was a cease and desist. The HOA accused him of trespassing on association-managed land and harassing board members. The tone dripped with legal arrogance. "Further infractions will result in civil action." Daniel laughed, the kind of laugh that hides exhaustion. He scanned the letter into his computer, filed it under evidence retaliation, and poured another cup of coffee. The next day, he paid a visit to the county building inspector's office. He laid out his photos, property maps, and GPS readings on the counter. The inspector, a man named Holden with decades of sun etched into his skin, studied them silently. "You're telling me," Holden said slowly, "this structure crosses the utility easement?" Daniel nodded. Holden whistled. "That's bold. Nobody builds over an easement unless they want a lawsuit from the power company." He pulled up county aerials, compared coordinates, and frowned. "Yeah, you're right. That room of his sits 12 feet into restricted land. Legally, it shouldn't exist." He printed an official notice of potential violation, stamped it, and handed it to Daniel. "File this with zoning enforcement. It'll trigger a site review." For the first time in weeks, Daniel felt the knot in his stomach loosen. On his way home, he drove past Pierce's house and saw him outside polishing the chrome trim on his SUV, Bluetooth headset in ear. Daniel slowed, rolled down his window, and simply said, "Nice sunroom, Calvin." "Hope you've got permits." Pierce's head snapped up, face tightening. "Stay off my property, Granger," he barked. "You've been warned." Daniel just smiled and drove off. That night, the cul-de-sac buzzed with whispers. Word of the pending zoning review spread faster than wildfire through the neighborhood Facebook group. Some residents secretly messaged Daniel, finally someone standing up to him. Others warned him to back down. Pierce was connected, had friends on the city council. But Daniel didn't care. He'd spent half his life building things that had to stand against weather, weight, and time. Now he was building a case that could do the same. A week later, the inspectors arrived, this time real ones, county badges visible, clipboards in hand. They surveyed Pierce's property for nearly 2 hours, while Daniel watched from his porch pretending to tinker with his truck. Pierce paced like a caged animal, phone glued to his ear. That evening, the inspectors left without a word, but Daniel saw one of them hand Pierce a yellow notice. The next morning, Pierce's wife drove away early and didn't return all day. By noon, a rumor had already circulated that the county had cited Pierce for unauthorized structure construction and easement obstruction. The fine alone would exceed $10,000, but the real blow was the potential demolition order. Still, Pierce wasn't done fighting. That night, Daniel's internet connection died. His mailbox was filled with HOA circulars about community safety concerns, and a strange pickup idled near his property long after midnight. Someone wanted to scare him. Instead, it just made him angry. The following weekend, Daniel invited 3 neighbors, people he trusted, to his kitchen table. He spread out maps, photos, emails, and inspection results. "We all know what he's been doing," Daniel said quietly. "He bullies anyone who doesn't fit his mold. I think it's time we show the rest of Maple Ridge what's really going on." They nodded. One neighbor, Karen, was a retired paralegal. She offered to draft an open letter to all residents demanding Pierce's resignation pending investigation. Another neighbor volunteered to contact the local news. Within 48 hours, the story broke. HOA president accused of building illegal addition on utility land. The Gazette ran it online first, then the evening broadcast picked it up. Daniel watched the segment alone in his living room as the camera panned across Pierce's house, bright yellow violation sticker gleaming on the glass sunroom. His phone buzzed with messages, some supportive, others furious. Pierce called an emergency HOA meeting for the next day. Attendance mandatory, the email read. Daniel knew it would be ugly, but he also knew something else. Bullies lose power when people stop being afraid. So he printed every document, every timestamp, and every permit, and stacked them neatly in a folder labeled Truth. The meeting took place in the community hall, under fluorescent lights that hummed like insects. Dozens of homeowners packed the rows, voices low, tension thick. Pierce sat at the head table in his tailored suit, flanked by 2 board members and a lawyer who looked barely old enough to rent a car. Pierce opened with a speech about baseless attacks and defamation, painting himself as a victim of personal vendettas. Daniel let him talk, let the room grow restless. Then he stood. "You talk about rules, Calvin," he said, voice steady. "So let's talk about the one you broke." He laid the county notice on the table for everyone to see. Unauthorized structure. Easement obstruction, filed by zoning enforcement. "That's not my opinion, that's the law." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Pierce's lawyer tried to interject, but Daniel wasn't finished. He projected the aerial photos onto the wall, a perfect color overlay showing Pierce's addition bleeding into public land. "While you were fining me for my porch railing," Daniel continued, "you built half your house where it doesn't belong." Pierce's face flushed crimson. "You have no idea what you're talking about," he shouted, slamming his palm on the table. But the damage was done. The board members exchanged uneasy looks. Residents began whispering, phones recording. Daniel stepped back, folded his arms, and said calmly, "You can threaten me all you want, Calvin, but this time the rules apply to you too." The next morning, Daniel woke to chaos. The HOA group chat had exploded overnight. Pierce had issued a statement blaming a clerical error for the violation, claiming the county inspector had misread the maps and that no illegal structure exists. It was pure spin, but desperation leaked from every word. His allies were abandoning him fast. By noon, 2 board members resigned for personal reasons. Daniel didn't need to guess why. The investigation had cracked something open. Still, he knew Pierce wasn't done. Bullies never surrender cleanly. They flail and smear until the end. Sure enough, a letter from Pierce's attorney arrived that afternoon, demanding Daniel cease public dissemination of defamatory materials and threatening a lawsuit for emotional distress. Daniel just smiled, scanned it, and forwarded it to the Gazette reporter who'd covered the last piece. "New development," he wrote. "He's threatening whistleblowers." Within hours, the journalist called him for a follow-up. "You sure you're comfortable going public?" she asked. "He's powerful in the county." Daniel thought of his father, who'd built their porch railing by hand and taught him never to fear the truth. He said, "Let him bring the light." The next day, the story hit the front page. HOA president threatens resident after county citation. That headline changed everything. The city zoning office launched a formal review. Pierce's lawyer withdrew 2 days later, citing irreconcilable differences. Then, the real hammer dropped, a letter from the county attorney's office confirming an active investigation into document falsification related to Pierce's original building permits. Turns out, Daniel's evidence had triggered a paper audit that unearthed discrepancies, signatures that didn't match, backdated approval stamps, missing inspections. Pierce had faked half his paperwork to rush his illegal addition through 5 years ago. What started as a neighborhood dispute was now a potential criminal case. News vans lined the cul-de-sac, cameras filming the now infamous sunroom with its violation sticker still peeling under the heat. Neighbors whispered, waved awkwardly, some apologizing to Daniel for doubting him. Others offered coffee and quiet support. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the roofs, Pierce's wife approached Daniel's porch. Her eyes were tired, makeup streaked. "I didn't know," she said softly. "He told me it was temporary, that it would get approved later." Daniel nodded, sympathy and relief mixing in his chest. "It's over soon," he said. "You deserve better than the mess he made." She just nodded and walked away into the fading light. 2 weeks later, Pierce was removed as HOA president in a 94% recall vote. The meeting was brief, almost ceremonial. Daniel didn't attend, he didn't need to. The truth had already done its work. But the final act came months later in court. Pierce stood before a county judge, facing charges of fraud, falsification of public records, and zoning violations totaling nearly $80,000 in fines and restitution. Daniel sat quietly in the back row as the judge read the verdict. "Mr. Pierce," she said, "you misused your authority and violated the same rules you were sworn to uphold. This court finds you guilty." The sound of the gavel echoed like thunder through the silent courtroom. Pierce's shoulders sagged, his arrogance finally broken. Outside, reporters swarmed Daniel for comment. He simply said, "The law doesn't care how big your house is. It cares how honest you are." That quote became the headline on every local paper. The HOA held new elections. This time, neighbors insisted on transparency, open meetings, public budgets, community votes for every major decision. Daniel was nominated for president but declined. "I'm not built for politics," he laughed. "I just wanted fairness." Instead, he volunteered to lead a new committee focused on property rights and homeowner education. The sunroom Pierce built was eventually demolished, replaced by a small public park the HOA funded after liquidating his fines. Where there was once arrogance and deceit now stood benches, flowers, and a metal plaque engraved with simple words. This space reminds us that truth outlasts power. Sometimes Daniel would walk past it at dusk, the same hour he'd once argued with inspectors and faced off against Pierce's smug grin. The cicadas hummed, porch lights flickered on across Maple Ridge, and peace finally returned to the street. He'd stop by the park bench, sip his coffee, and smile faintly. "Guess we rebuilt something good after all," he'd murmur to himself. And somewhere deep down, he knew this wasn't just about a fence, a rule, or a sunroom. It was about standing firm when truth costs you sleep. And winning not by shouting, but by shining a light so bright, even hypocrisy can't survive it.